Welcome to Storytime, brought to you by the OWSCyCon2019, the online book event of the year.
The rest of her classes were about the same as the first, and the more time that passed, the more tired she became. By the time lunch arrived, she was ready to just relax. She wasn't very hungry and only ate half of her chicken salad sandwich before deciding that she had eaten enough. She packed up her lunch and then exited the cafeteria like she did every day and made her way toward the art room. She was earlier than she usually was today, and when she arrived, Ms. Brannan hadn't yet arrived. Sarah entered the room and began wandering around the room, looking at the paintings until she heard the shuffling of feet near the doorway. Sarah began saying as she turned around, then stopped when she realized it wasn't Ms. Brannan that had entered the room. Instead, there were 5 girls from her classes standing there glaring at her. Sarah knew that now was the time for their nasty fix. Jess Cartwright, a somewhat snobby and pinch-faced girl with mousy brown hair, was the leader of that little group. Her parents were rich, and the other girls followed her lead in most everything. If they didn't like someone, then the others didn't like them either. None of them had a brain for themselves or the courage not to be sheep. The others stood behind her as they were her bodyguards, and Sarah knew that they would act in that capacity if necessary. What? No teacher or boyfriend to protect you now? You look awfully tired today, Sarah. I noticed you yawning all day today. Stay up late last night? Jess asked her in a snotty and insinuating tone as she stepped further into the room and closer to where Sarah stood about 15 feet in front of them. When Sarah didn't respond, Jess continued with her taunting. Didn't David say something this morning about staying up late with his geometry? Is that what he calls it? Are you his geometry? I've heard that girls that live in orphanages learn about the birds and the bees earlier than most girls. Did you get an education with him last night? I hear that supervision in those places is pretty lax. Even so, I don't know why he would want to stay up all night with you. He could have come to my house. My parents were gone almost until midnight last night. Oh well, I guess he didn't want to have to work for it, and he knew you would easily accommodate his needs. Normally anything that Jess or any of the others had to say wouldn't have upset Sarah. She was used to being tormented and mean things being said to her, but for some reason this time was different. With every word that came out of her mouth, Sarah became angrier. This wasn't just about her, this had to do with David as well, and if there was one thing Sarah couldn't put up with, is anyone saying anything bad about him. He had been her best friend since they were toddlers. She could feel her face growing hot with rage and fury, and the words Jess continued to spew forth growing fuzzy to her brain, and in the next instant she didn't have any idea of what was happening. She was no longer in control of herself. It was as if Sarah was watching a slow-motion movie from somewhere outside of her body, and she could only watch the other people in the room. She knew that she had jumped toward Jess, and that the other girls had looked at her in horror before screaming and fleeing from the room. Sarah only saw a flurry of motion and some flashes of blue in her mind. "Oh God, Sarah, no!" Sarah heard a female voice from near the open doorway. Sarah looked up and saw Miss Brannan dropping the painting she held in her hands as she ran forward toward her with her hands out in front of her. "No, Sarah, this shouldn't be happening yet. You're not old enough yet. Let her go and try to calm down. She won't hurt you ever again," Miss Brannan said in a calm and soothing voice as she stepped closer and laid a hand on her shoulder. Sarah instantly felt much more calm with her touch than she had a mere moment before, and looked down to see Jess lying on the floor with a bloody nose as she covered her face with her arms in front of her. She was crying hysterically and was curled into a ball before her. "I'm sorry, what?" Sarah began asking, and then caught sight of what should have been her own hands, but they weren't. They were a light blue color with long talon-like nails. She moved the fingers as she inspected them more closely. They moved according to what she wanted them to do, but this wasn't right. This was impossible and frightening. "Get it off of me! Help!" she screamed as she began flailing around the room, shaking her arms in an effort to get rid of whatever had taken her over. "It's all right. Calm down. We will help you," Miss Brannan said as she took a gentle grip on her hands. "What is this?" Sarah asked her as she looked up at her teacher again, and when she did, she could see David standing in the doorway and looking at them with his jaw open and his eyes wide. Miss Brannan, seeing where Sarah's gaze had settled, turned to look and saw the young man staring in disbelief at what he now saw. "Sarah, how? What?" David stammered as he stood frozen in place. "David, no, what?" Sarah said as she took a step toward him, to which he instinctively took a step back away from her. He seemed afraid of her. "No, David," she cried aloud, and in embarrassment and desperation to be out of sight, she ran straight toward the window. With a crash of broken and falling glass, she heaved herself up onto the ledge and then flung herself off the ledge of the second-floor window.
This story time was read by Virginia Carraway Stark and brought to you in conjunction with the OWSCyCon 2019. OWSCyCon runs from May 17th through May 19th. You can find us at OWSCyCon.OurRightSide.com. Again, OWSCyCon.OurRightSide.com. We have events happening across all genres. If you are a reader, you cannot afford to miss this event. You never know. You may just find your next best read.